There are legitimate questions about whether the BBC knew anything at all about these offences. There are legitimate questions about whether it asked the right questions of Huw Edwards at the time that the original suggestions were made about him. There are questions to be asked about whether effective checks were made.
Let's kick off with his Huw Edwards story. He has just pleaded guilty to 3 counts of making indecent images of children. The former BBC presenter, the lead presenter, admitted having 41 indecent images of children, which had been sent to him by another man on WhatsApp. Now, the sentencing has now been adjourned until September for a pre-sentence report because Huw Edwards has pleaded guilty. In the meantime, he has been released on conditional bail. Now, as you all know, Huw Edwards was one of the BBC's most high-profile and best-paid stars of the newsroom. He was one of the main presenters on the 10 o'clock news. He was the face of national coverage for national events. I mentioned at the top of the show the death of the Queen and other big events. Now, let's dig into this. And we're going to speak with Professor Tim Luckhurst, a former BBC executive, in a moment. But first, let's catch up with Alec Farber, who is media correspondent for The Times. He joins us in the studio. Alex, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Give us an overview of what happened today in court.
So today in court, Huw Edwards attended, as you said, Westminster Magistrates Court. There was a real bundle, a bit of a scrum outside the court. There was press photographers, there was journalists. I think one photographer was knocked to the ground. There was also activists holding up some placards, which were kind of abusing, with messages about the BBC and its complicitness. He then went into court number 1 with his legal team. It's worth saying he was accompanied by police officers to help him through the scrum. He then went into court number 1 for around a half-hour hearing where he sat fidgeting, looking a little bit nervous from time to time, didn't really make eye contact with the reporters in what was a packed gallery, and adjusted his tie. And then, spoke briefly to confirm his name and his specifics, his address, etc. And then, pled guilty straight out the barrel to the 3 counts, which caused some shock and surprise, because I'm not sure people were anticipating that.
And why do you think he just did that? I mean, obviously, we've got to be careful about not speculating too much. What do you think has gone on there?
Sure. I mean, look, he would have taken legal advice from his team, and clearly they felt that they didn't want to go through a long case and court. So they thought it was best just to, put their hands up, admit to the wrongdoing, and by doing so, it's worth saying, the likelihood is that you receive a shorter, if there isn't some kind of custodial term, you receive a shorter sentence. There's more leniency there.
And it's worth just reflecting, Alex, when this story first broke, it was a very, very shocking story, but it didn't just affect Huw Edwards, because for quite a long time there was this rampant speculation on social media where other very high-profile male presenters were being named on the internet. I mean, this was a big case.
That's right. I mean, look, and it's worth pointing out that these crimes do not relate to the allegations that appeared in the Sun newspaper around a year ago, which sparked, as you say, Aisha, this witch hunt, if you like, with the Sun didn't name Huw Edwards initially, and so it was an unnamed BBC presenter, which then provoked a kind of furore of, well, who's the guy? Who is the individual at the centre of these allegations? And we then got into a situation where high-profile BBC presenters were saying, look, it's not me, I've not been suspended. Ultimately, a few days later, Huw's wife, who's a well-regarded TV producer, came out with a statement in which she named Huw Edwards as the individual at the centre of the claims. It's worth saying that the Metropolitan Police investigated those claims at the time and found that there was no crimes that they could find, although Edwards didn't return to the BBC following his suspension from those reports. He resigned in April, citing his mental health. But these crimes for which he has pled guilty this morning are completely separate to the incident from a year ago.
And it's also just worth saying these are incredibly serious crimes, these Category A, Category B category C. I mean, I'm not even going to read out, because we're on a lunchtime, what these involve, but it is involving children, sadism. I mean, horrific levels. If he's found, well, he has pleaded to being guilty. What kind of sentence might he face for a crime like this?
Well, look, I'm no legal expert, it's worth saying, but from my understanding, these, as you say, these are serious crimes, and there is the prospect of custodial sentences for, up to 10 years. It has been reported. Now, whether or not, obviously, his decision to plead guilty would go some way to reducing that. But we're now in a position whereby the magistrate in today's court said that he wanted, as you mentioned at the top of the conversation, a probation report where he wanted to learn more about Huw Edwards. He wanted to find out more about whether he was likely to reoffend. He wanted to know more about his mental health. And he then said that he may well not have sufficient powers to sentence as he might, as may be required. So it may well be that the decision is passed up to a Crown Court, which I believe has greater powers to issue longer sentences.
Okay, and it's also worth remembering we have got a big prisons crisis at the moment in terms of overcrowding. Alex, thanks very much for your time. That's our media correspondent here at the Times, Alex Farber. Well, let's now speak with Professor Tim Luckhurst. Tim's a former BBC executive, and he's now the principal of South College, Durham University. Tim, thank you very much for joining us.
Pleasure.
I mean, you have worked with Huw Edwards. How shocked are you by his admission today?
I've been shocked by all of the allegations which have emerged about Huw Edwards, which is not to say that I doubt their veracity, but simply because when I worked with Huw, he was a young political reporter who was rapidly promoted, a very popular member of the team in BBC News, someone who worked extremely hard, who was extremely reliable, willing to get up early to appear on the Today programme at 6:30 in the morning and discuss politics. He was also someone who I think I remember had quite a reputation for flirting with the young women in the office. So these allegations have come as a huge surprise to many colleagues who worked with Huw for a long time, because they appear to reveal something about Huw that none of us even speculated about and certainly were not aware of. I must wonder, and I think it's legitimate to ask this question, although I'll never get an answer, whether these are failings which have emerged later in Huw's life, because he was happily married for a long time and does have a family of children who he has raised quite successfully. But clearly something has gone spectacularly wrong.
Absolutely, and these are incredibly serious offences. I mean, let's now sort of look at the BBC, which of course many people will be having these conversations today. I mean, do you think the BBC should have done more in terms of looking at his behaviour? I mean, many people will say, look, there have been big stars within the BBC, Jimmy Savile, Russell Brand, men, not always men, but largely very, very powerful men, real stars, like the big talent. Do you think the BBC has sort of turned a bit of a blind eye to his behaviour?
Sorry, I'm not very well at the moment, so excuse the cough.
Sorry.
That's right. Yes, I think the answer is the jury's out, and we're going to have to wait. The simple truth is that these allegations, which are now clearly admitted and which will therefore lead at some point to sentencing, are very, very serious indeed, and I make no defence whatsoever of that behaviour. But equally clearly, they seem to have occurred quite late in Huw's career. We will have to see what the chronology really is, and that may be something which emerges as further evidence is advanced, although we cannot be sure about that. But my suspicion is that these are things which have happened towards the end of Huw's career, that there would be no awareness whatsoever of such private conduct at the BBC unless he himself had come forward and said that he'd been guilty of such offences, which plainly he didn't do. Now, if it does emerge that the BBC knew anything, that would of course be extremely serious.
And that's that's the big unknown, isn't it, at this stage? And of course we can't sort of speculate, but that is the big unknown. And when the first story broke, the Sun story broke, there were people who did come out and raise some issues. I mean, the BBC, and it was interesting that the BBC did actually kind of, move him out quite quickly when there were quite a lot of people on social media and people who very, very much supported Huw Edwards sort of having a bit of a go at the BBC. But look, as you say, we'll have to wait and see. There'll have to be a proper inquiry into all of this. But the other question I think, Tim, people will want to know is that this obviously happened towards the end of his career, but he was earning a lot of money. And between 2023 and 2024, despite being taken off air, he was paid, over £450,000. Do you think there'll be questions raised about that?
I think that there are legitimate questions about whether the BBC knew anything at all about these offences. There are legitimate questions about whether it asked the right questions of Huw Edwards at the time that the original suggestions were made about him. There are questions to be asked about whether effective checks were made. But it does appear from the chronology that these are events which happened late in Huw Edwards' career. It also appears that if Huw Edwards was not forthcoming with his employer about the original allegations, which have essentially proved not to be in any way criminal or substantively wrong, but that the new convictions obviously are based upon really serious offences. If he didn't talk about the first one to the BBC, is it really credible to expect the BBC to have known about these offences? Perhaps, and the BBC must answer the questions, but I would imagine that any human being involved in criminal behaviour would seek to hide that behaviour from their employer. And whilst we can only possibly speculate about that, I don't think we can assume the BBC knew anything. We are entitled to ask them what they knew,
well, I
but
think
we
that's
can't
the
assume
thing.
that they did.
We can't assume that they did know. We can't assume that they didn't know anything either. I mean, I think we'll probably just have to wait and see what comes out next. I mean, we all know that in
it'll
big
be
old...
about the nature of the inquiry. I mean, there are legitimate questions to ask of the BBC, and the BBC will have to be completely transparent about answering them and about investigating thoroughly. I hope it will do that. I expect it will do that, but it will have to do it thoroughly in
and
order
it will
to
have to do
dispel
it.
any suggestion.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, Tim, really good to catch up with you. Thanks very much for your time. That's Professor Tim Luckhurst, a former BBC editor, now Principal of South College at Durham University.